So, Rich, first thing I want to talk about is what your team took from Elder Scrolls Legends and what you guys learned from that lesson from your studio when you were creating your own card game for Elder Scrolls Online.
Well, I mean, Legends was definitely a place that we started, just kind of looking at it and whatnot. But we looked at a lot of different games. We're all gamers. We're all huge nerds. We love, just playing games and dissecting them and seeing what works and what doesn't. Legends was definitely an inspiration for sure. Games like Dominion or Ascension, all of those types of games really helped kind of frame some of the conversations we had as developers. And then we started digging into, our own take on things and what a card game in Tamriel specifically being played by the actual people in Tamriel would be like, and ended up with Tribute.
Can you kind of elaborate a little bit on the process of deciding to you're always great at building your world up. You build a foundation, you keep building on top of it and expanding the world essentially. Can you talk about like why you decided to do that as opposed to something another studio may do where they'll make a card game and they'll have it out completely outside the universe, right? It won't be attached to the MMO at all. It's its own thing, but even though it takes place in the world or has that same theme, walk us through the process about how you decided to have this be physically in Tamriel instead of having it be like an offshoot new game that you can play outside of the MMO.
Sure. So I think that the biggest thing to kind of keep in mind is we are trying to flesh the world out. We are trying to make it a place that feels like a living, breathing world. We want to give players lots of different activities. And as we've kind of progressed throughout the years, we just celebrated our 8th anniversary on the 4th of being live. We wanted to have more of those alternate activities. We've got tons of questing, tons of killing, really, really good stuff. We have some alternate activities, but what we were kind of missing was an alternate activity that had social aspects to it. And so we hit really early on that we wanted to do something like this with ESO. In fact, as far back as like 2009, I remember pitching ideas of tavern games. But of course, we were trying to work towards actually launching the game at that point, so we kind of put it on the back burner. But we really like this concept of if you just don't want to quest or you don't want to kill or you want to, kind of chill and hang out with your friends in Discord or have a beer and just kind of do your own thing, you can do that and there's something there for you to do, and the card game is that really cool new social way to play the game.
It's also really interesting from a design perspective because you have pre-constructed decks rather than having like a base set of cards with expansions that people can mix and match. Can you talk about that design decision? I'm sure balancing has got to be much easier for that reason.
So one of the things we wanted to do was make the game as accessible as possible, make it really easy to kind of pick up and play, but difficult to master. And having that kind of concept really early on helped us with making a lot of the decisions we made. And one of those was, these pre-constructed decks and the actual sharing of, I choose 2 decks, my opponent chooses 2 decks, and then we have to build the best possible hand or series of cards based on what's in front of us. And so it was a very different strategical kind of choice and really leads into this interesting mastery curve where you don't go and spend a lot of time or look up make the perfect deck offline and then slam people with your deck. You are at the mercy of your opponent, but also kind of at the mercy of how the cards are drawn up. And so you're making cool strategy decisions, and you're making them on the fly rather than doing all of that kind of beforehand.
Is it difficult because you're one of the very few people, like I said, who build on this foundation and I know you update the software and change it as time evolves, but it's still the same kind of code and stuff you started with all those years ago. Is it difficult adding like a whole new mechanics like mini games into this world that's already have like this established code and all these like design things that are already existing within it? Is it hard to add additional elements to make sure they all go in smoothly and fit into the world and everything works?
Certainly challenging, yes. I think one of the, I mean, there are definitely technical constraints and things that, we would love to do that we can't just because that's not how the engine works or whatnot. But I think that the biggest challenge is making everything that we add to the game feel like it has been there since launch. And I think the team does a really good job of integrating those things. You look at antiquities, you look at companions, tribute is another really good example, and there's lots and lots of examples. Housing, so on and so forth. They're all tightly integrated into all of the various game systems, so it just kind of feels like it's always been there. Especially if you're a brand new player coming in, it doesn't feel like, well, this is clearly this feature for this kind of chapter because I only ever see it in this area. It's all throughout the world, and that makes a huge difference.
What was the hardest part of this expansion that you personally worked on when you were developing it?
Tribute has definitely been a challenge. To build an entirely new game within a game is the team has just done an amazing job at that. That has definitely been a huge challenge. I think the other big challenge for this was trying to make the storyline that we created, this political storyline, a little bit more grounded in reality, still every bit as exciting, if not more exciting, than a 100-foot tall demon Daedric prince coming in to destroy the world. So that was definitely a challenging thing for the team to do as well.
Yeah, I've interviewed your writers a few months ago, and they've said the same thing. The key in fantasy is to lean into tropes and try to tell those tropes differently. And yeah, I mean, you certainly did in this expansion. No Daedric threat that's going to destroy humanity. It's much more political. The stakes are, I don't want to say lower, they're just different than they were aside from a demon-killing prince coming into the realm wanting to destroy everything.
Yeah, like in that last example, like it's very clear what needs to happen and what the stakes are. With a kind of more of a political mystery type story, you spend quite a bit of time actually trying to figure out what's going on, and that in and of itself is very interesting. But it's just a different way of doing it.
I mean, like, and in terms of design aesthetic for your art design aesthetic for High Isle, I mean, I absolutely love what you do in each expansion. You try to push your team into different areas, different zones, get out of your comfort areas to do like, Gothic architecture to, when you're doing the area in Skyrim, and now you're on a High Island. And it's what's really interesting about this expansion specifically is that for a game that's a fantasy game at its core, we really don't see a lot of medieval themes in ESO a lot until now. The duels, the banners, like the royalty, the whole upper class society. Can you talk a little about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've been asked this question a lot. Why the Bretons? Why now? And a lot of it boils down to they're a very cool race. They have a very interesting culture because it is really accessible. The Breton culture is as close to real world kind of European medieval history as you can kind of get with a twist. And when you haven't really done that ever in the game that you're working on, it's a breath of fresh air and something new and something exciting. And so we were able to really dig into that and leverage that. And the team had a blast going in and telling new types of stories with a focus on a race and a culture that has really never had that deep dive before.
Now, we've seen other digital card games come out, and a lot of these card games, they can't exist in a physical space just because of the way they're designed. Could this card game exist in a physical space in the real world?
Absolutely. And that was actually one of the core design pillars that I gave the team when we first started talking about the game. And our art director, CJ Greb, actually asked me if I was serious about that, which was, I want this to feel like a living, breathing game. I wanted this to feel like the normal, everyday populace in Tamriel could play this. I didn't want it crazy. I didn't want it busy. I wanted it to feel like a game that had been played for thousands of years. And when you look at the game board in game, there's not a lot to it. It's some cards, a couple of tokens, and an hourglass, and that's it. So all things that you could kind of put in a bag and carry with you to the bar or while you're waiting on a ship, and you can just jump in and play. It's really really easy, and so that was a huge discussion point for a long time early on in design, and I think it's really paid off.
Now, and like just as a fun question, do you have any plans to make this card game like an actual physical release, like for people to play with maybe like digital bonuses or something if they subscribe to ESO?
How did I know that question was coming? I mean, I'd be lying if I said I hadn't thought about that. I know players are going to want, a standalone. They're going to want a physical version. And, ultimately, our goal right now is let's make it as good as we can for ESO. Release it to the public, see what the reception is like, and then kind of go from there. I think we've done a really good job over the years of listening to feedback and to supporting features and content that players resonate with.
Speaking to that, like since ESO, like you see, we've talked before about why you can't do crossplay and cross save just because the architecture of your systems is so old and kind of set. To do that would be a lot more work than you guys have time for. Do you think that because you're in a box, like creatively, like do you have these limitations with the systems and the software that you're actually more creative and you're more successful in what you do because you have these extreme limitations other than just having to make a sequel every 4 years or 2 years or whatnot with a new engine?
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting take on things for sure. I the closest that I can relate that to is kind of within the storytelling boxes that we have, right? People ask me a lot, how hard is it to tell a story within an established lore versus how hard is it to tell something brand new? And I think they both have their challenges. One lets you be super creative and kind of do whatever, but the other makes you be potentially even more creative, like you were mentioning. So I think it definitely has its pluses and its minuses. Pluses in you have to be super careful. Absolutely, like you said, super, super careful. Everything you do has to be planned and extremely well thought out to make it fit within the existing architecture. But that can get tiring at times. And sometimes it's just nice to do something wild and crazy and completely different.
And you guys are doing so much of this expansion in terms of stories and zones and the card game, but when do you guys talk about like new classes added to the game? Like when does that become a discussion? Because I know it's something people ask for a lot, but I know it's also a tremendous amount of work to add a new class to the game into an ecosystem like this.
Always part of the discussion. We hear players talk about it constantly. We're all players of the game too, and we're like, hey, when does it make sense? Should we do a new class? What do we do? And ultimately, the way we kind of solve those or answer those questions is we look at the game as a whole. Like, what's missing from the game? We've got lots of questing, we've got lots of killing, we've got lots of item sets and classes and skill lines and whatnot. So we've been focusing on a lot of alternate activities recently, and one of the reasons why we chose the card game was because we don't have a lot of alternate activities that can be social, that you can play with your friends. Antiquities is great, but it's more solo focused. Companions are great, but they're a little bit more solo focused. So, this year it was like, hey, what is something that we can do that kind of hits the largest possible group that we can, from the social aspects to the PvE aspects to the PvP aspects. And this was the perfect thing.
And then my last thing isn't really a question, but more of a compliment, because there are so many other games out there that are a service that will constantly change things or add what they call borrowed powered mechanics, right? They'll do something new in an expansion, and then after the expansion, they just get rid of it. You usually stay away from that as much as you can, and you have very few. You've had borrowed powered mechanics before, but not as many as other competitors have, and it's so impressive that you continue to build and improve upon this game every year without having to get rid of stuff or retcon things. And I'm sure you do on the inside all the time, but from a player perspective, I just see this world continue to grow, and I can go anywhere, do anything. Like, everything's still in the game. I can revisit old locations, do old raids. I can do all that stuff. It's really interesting that your game, among all the others, really takes pride in building upon a world and making everything a part of that world permanently moving forward.
Well, I definitely appreciate the praise, and that is one of our core philosophies, right? Which is we're making a world, we're building the world out, so let's make sure it feels like it's always been a part of the world.
And then my very last thing, and I have to ask it, Rich. I have to ask it every time because people will be like,
Uh-oh.
"Why didn't he ask?" So, cross-player, cross-save. Any updates you can share with us at the current time?
No, I mean we're still in that kind of same place where there's technology challenges. It's a huge thorny problem, but there's also kind of some of the social challenges as well, where each platform has their own social systems. Each mega server has its own unique economies and own unique communities. And as soon as you start to kind of change that, you have to start thinking about the implications. PC players have add-ons which allow them to do things like Master Rick Crafter, and allow them to use TTC, Tamriel Trade Center, to manipulate the guild traders and whatnot. So they have like a monetary advantage over our console players. What does it do to the economy when you start throwing PC players on console and back and forth? So it's a huge thorny problem that no, we don't have any updates on.
I asked though. That was the important thing, is that people
yeah,
at
you
least
did.
asked. And then, so when can people get their hands on High Isle and play your card game?
So it is June 6th, I believe, for PC, and then 2 weeks later for the consoles.